We are now going to go into a review of the building blocks for vSphere virtual networking. These have been covered in a prior course, but for our purposes, a quick review and then we'll be on our way. We are going to focus on the distributed virtual switch primarily. Modern designs primarily use the distributed virtual switch. There's very limited use of the standard switch. Usually what I have seen is, for simplicity's sake, people leave the management VM kernel port on there. Everything else is moved over to the distributed virtual switch, because after all, they're managing such a large number of hosts. It's almost impossible to operate without a distributed virtual switch. The management network is reasonably straightforward, but again, I've seen folks also run management networks on the DVS. They move it over at a later date after installation. There will be a lot of discussion and options based on the load balancing or the load sharing options that are available to us. So we're talking about route based on originating port ID. When a virtual machine starts up, it is assigned a port, and based on a hash of the port and the number of physical NICs, VM NICs that have been assigned to that port, it would be an active configuration for all the virtual for all the VM NICs, and the traffic from the virtual machine would be hashed across, would be pinned to one of them. Other options exist as well in the distributed virtual switch. There's the option for load-based teaming as well. So you have the ability, or the switch automatically switches the traffic to a different physical adapter, different VM NIC, depending on the traffic pattern. So if the traffic on any given physical NIC is more than 75% of bandwidth, basically, of over a period of 30 seconds, then there are some interesting things in terms of switching traffic to less used physical NICs that actually takes place. So that actually works very well, because that is actually true load balancing. It's not just load sharing. We will look at some other ways also. We look at some commands for a Nexus switch, which you can actually use. You can check to see how in a given port channel the traffic would actually be routed, and you can also run a quick command with a source and destination ID specified to determine which one of the links in the port channel will be used. So we'll get to it when we start having that discussion. NIC teaming options. Basically, you could put maybe one or more NICs into a team and assign a port group to actually utilize them. Now, the interesting part about those options is that all those NICs in that team would be active, and that depending on your load balancing option or the load sharing option that you've considered, such as route based on originating port ID, or on MAC on the MAC address. That's how the actual link is selected and traffic is pinned to that. But of course, with a distributed virtual switch, you can now create in version 5 and now in version 6, of course, and we'll be only considering ESXi version 6 here in this course. You have the ability to create multiple link aggregation groups, port channels basically, and LACP port channels. So you now have the ability, of course, upstream to use Cisco VPC or an MLAG configuration. And now, because you can have multiple link aggregation groups, you now have the ability to actually connect upstream in many flexible ways, because you have those available. In fact, that comes in handy nowadays, because you usually want to separate VM traffic from your IP storage traffic, which is becoming much more prevalent. And so if you have a link aggregation group assigned to a switch that is handling your iSCSI or NFS traffic, as we will see in the case study, we'll go through some options there. then this really comes in handy, the multiple link aggregation groups, because you probably have, and it's good practice actually, to have separate networks for VM traffic as well as for IP storage traffic. So we will look at iSCSI networks. Modern devices, storage arrays are more and more moving away from fiber channel connectivity and moving to Ethernet connectivity. So there's a huge increase in the number of modern storage arrays that actually use iSCSI, and the same thing for NFS as well. NFS actually works quite well with vSphere, and various reasons for that, and we will look at some configurations for NFS as well, some interesting aspects. In vSphere version 6, you have the ability to have multiple TCP/IP stacks. That also is very useful, because initially at installation time, there are 3 TCP/IP stacks that are created, and only one of them is used, and that's called the default TCP/IP stack. 2 other TCP/IP stacks are actually available, but are not initially utilized. The first one is called the provisioning TCP/IP stack, and the next one is for vMotion. So what happens is that after initial installation, when you configure new VM kernel adapters or VM kernel ports to actually use to be used for vMotion, for example, at that time you can assign the vMotion TCP/IP stack to that, and that's when it actually becomes active. Otherwise, even vMotion, if it's not set up that way, would use the default stack, and of course the default gateway. Same thing for provisioning as well. Provisioning has to do with basically cloning and snapshots and so on. So there could be a large amount of traffic there as well on an occasional basis. And so in some cases, it's good to have a separate network set up with its own TCP/IP stack. And obviously the most important thing about the separate TCP/IP stack is that you have your own gateway out of that, so you're able to connect it to a completely different network and not have to go through the management network all the time, because the management network is usually connected to a data center management network, or should be. So with the availability of these TCP/IP stack options, especially for storage, you have now the ability to create new TCP/IP stacks, and they can only be used for IP storage. So that gives you obviously a very easy separation between your management networks and VM networks, VM traffic networks, and your IP storage networks. And just kind of thinking about it, you then are able to rather more easily assign, if you have a couple of adapters available, you can actually run your IP storage on those 2 adapters on an active standby basis, or even on a link aggregated basis. We'll look at these options. We'll kind of do some thinking while we sketch out the various possibilities as we go further into this course.